Professor, let's start with the question everyone in Washington is avoiding. You've said this war is heading toward American ground troops on Iranian soil. Air power hasn't worked. Naval power hasn't worked. Is a ground invasion now inevitable?
I wouldn't say inevitable, but I'd say it's the direction the logic of this war is pushing us toward. Look at what's actually happened. This started with a decapitation strike. The U.S. and Israel killed Iran's supreme leader and a huge portion of the senior military and political leadership at the end of February. That's about as devastating a tactical blow as air power can deliver. And yet, months later, Iran hasn't collapsed. It's consolidated. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to normal commercial traffic. That's not what a winning air campaign looks like. When the branch you've used decisively fails to produce submission, the political pressure shifts to the next branch. Naval pressure hasn't reopened the strait either. That leaves ground forces as the only tool left that hasn't been tried at scale. That's not a prediction of what's wise, it's a description of where the pressure is building.
But sending American troops into Iran, a country of over 90 million people, mountainous terrain the size of California, sounds like a catastrophic escalation. Why would any president choose that path knowingly?
Because the alternative, politically, feels worse to the people making the decision. This is what I call the escalation trap. It's not that leaders sit down and calmly conclude ground war is the smart move. It's that admitting the current strategy has failed becomes politically unbearable, so the pressure is always to escalate rather than concede. Trump signed a memorandum of understanding in June that appeared to lay out a diplomatic off-ramp. It unraveled within 48 hours. That tells you how fragile any negotiated path has been. Each failed off-ramp doesn't reset the pressure to zero. It adds to it. The sunk cost, the credibility on the line, the sense that backing down now means the whole campaign was for nothing. That's what pushes toward the next rung on the ladder, not sober calculation.
Let's talk about the mechanics of how a ground war actually begins. You've argued it isn't a single decision, it's a process. Walk me through that.
Right, and this is the part people miss. A ground war doesn't start with a president announcing we are invading. It starts with infrastructure. Air power needs forward bases to sustain a tempo of strikes. Those bases need runways extended, fuel and munitions stockpiled, ports expanded to move all of that in. Once you've built that infrastructure, it becomes a target itself. Now you need to protect it. Protecting a fixed position under contested skies from drones and missiles increasingly requires forces on the ground, not just aircraft overhead. So the chain runs. Air power creates forward positions. Positions become targets. Targets require protection. Protection requires ground forces. By the time you're debating whether to send in troops, in a real sense, you already have. The logistics tail is already there and already vulnerable. The political announcement is often just catching up to what the deployment already implies.
So you're saying by the time we're having this conversation, the groundwork, literally, may already be laid.
That's exactly my concern. Once ports are expanded and stockpiles are surged forward, you reach what I call the point of no return. Not because anyone wants a ground war, but because no administration will allow an exposed force to simply be overrun. At that point, the question stops being, should we do this, and becomes, we have to protect what we've already built. That's a very different and much more dangerous place to be making decisions from.
Let's press on the actual military picture. Even if ground forces move in, what would they realistically be trying to achieve? And is that achievable against Iran specifically?
The stated objective would almost certainly be narrow at first, securing a choke point. most likely something tied to reopening the Strait of Hormuz or securing energy infrastructure. Small defensible objectives sound appealing because they're limited, but a small ground force holding a fixed point in hostile territory is inherently unstable. It either gets reinforced or it gets overrun or worn down. And Iran's advantage here is terrain and depth. This is a large mountainous country where drone and missile capability can be dispersed and hidden. You are not going to secure the Strait of Hormuz by holding one port. Shipping companies won't send tankers back into that corridor while Iranian strike capability remains intact and hidden across the country. So even a tactically successful landing doesn't solve the actual economic problem driving the war, which is the closure of that strait.
That's a striking point, that even a, quote, successful ground operation might not fix the actual crisis. What is the crisis in concrete terms right now?
Commercial tanker traffic through Hormuz has slowed to a near halt. We're talking roughly an 80% drop in volume, with barely any large crude carriers making the transit in a given week. At the same time, the Bab el-Mandeb corridor is under pressure from Houthi actions forcing vessels to turn back. So you have two of the world's most important choke points for energy shipping under simultaneous strain. That is an extraordinary situation for the global economy, and it is the underlying reason the political pressure in Washington keeps building toward we have to physically take this back.
Let's turn to something you highlighted recently, Trump abruptly canceling planned strikes, citing progress toward a peace agreement. Iran denied that any such negotiations were happening. What do you make of that moment?
It fits a pattern we've now seen repeatedly, a claimed diplomatic breakthrough that the other side doesn't confirm, followed by a pause rather than a resolution. I'd be very cautious about reading that pause as the end of anything. In escalation dynamics, sudden pauses often serve a domestic political purpose. They let a leader show restraint or claim progress without actually committing to de-escalation. The test is whether the underlying military posture, the forward positioning, the stockpiles, the readiness is being drawn down. If it isn't, then the pause is tactical, not strategic. Based on what's been reported, I don't see evidence the underlying trajectory has changed.
You've drawn a direct historical parallel to Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson. Explain that comparison, because for a lot of viewers, that word alone signals disaster.
The comparison isn't about the specific battlefield. It's about the political mechanics. We have Johnson's own private conversations on tape, where he admits privately that he doesn't believe the military options in front of him will actually win the war, but he escalates anyway because he believes it will delay a visible defeat past the next election. That is the exact calculus I think Trump faces now, with the midterms roughly 3.5 months out at the point this analysis was made. Owning a strategic defeat, Iran effectively controlling a critical global choke point right before an election, is politically catastrophic. So the incentive is to buy time, even if the people making the decision privately doubt the next escalation will actually resolve the underlying problem. That's the trap. It's rational for each individual actor to escalate, even when the aggregate outcome is worse for everyone, including the country escalating.
Let's zoom out. Given everything, the probability of ground troops, where China and Russia fit into this, how exposed U.S. allies in the Gulf and Israel are, where American public opinion stands, what failure would actually look like on the ground, and who currently holds the leverage, what's the full picture right now, and where does this ultimately leave things?
Let me take that piece by piece because it all connects. As of my most recent assessment, I put the odds at around 70% that we see a ground deployment onto Iranian soil within roughly a month. I want to be precise about what that number means. It is not a claim that ground troops will win, or even that this is the wise choice. It's an assessment of political trajectory given the incentives in play. A midterm election bearing down, two major choke points effectively closed to commercial shipping, and a series of collapsed diplomatic openings that have each made backing down look more costly than the last. These are judgment calls based on observable trajectory, not hard fact. And trajectories can shift, especially if there's a genuine change in the underlying posture rather than just a rhetorical pause. Now bring in the other major powers, because they shape how much room Washington actually has. China's primary interest is energy security and stability of shipping lanes. It's a massive importer of Gulf oil, so a prolonged closure of Hormuz isn't something Beijing wants either. That said, a United States tied down in a costly, unpopular ground war in the Middle East is strategically useful to China elsewhere, particularly around Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific, where American military and political bandwidth would otherwise be focused. Russia's calculus is more straightforwardly opportunistic. A U.S. mired in an escalating Middle East conflict has less capacity, attention, and political will to sustain support for Ukraine. Neither power wants a full collapse of global energy markets, but both have reasons to be in less of a hurry than Washington to see this resolved quickly. Regional allies are extremely exposed, and that's underappreciated. Gulf states hosting American infrastructure become targets themselves, whether or not they want to be involved. There have been reports of sirens sounding simultaneously in multiple countries during flare-ups, which tells you this isn't contained to Iran and the U.S. alone. It has a genuine regional blast radius. Israel has its own direct stakes, given its role in the initial strike on the Iranian leadership. The tighter the U.S. and Israel are seen as acting in concert, the more Gulf partners have to weigh the benefit of the American security relationship against the risk of becoming a frontline target. That's a real strategic vulnerability for Washington. It can't assume unlimited regional basing access if this grinds on. Domestically, public support has been declining as the conflict drags on, which is a familiar pattern. Initial strikes generate a rally around the flag effect, but sustained, open-ended conflict without resolution erodes that steadily. The problem is that declining support doesn't automatically translate into an off-ramp politically, because reversing course and accepting a strategic loss carries its own severe cost, arguably a bigger and more immediate one heading into a midterm. That's the trap. Both continuing to escalate and accepting defeat are politically painful, and the incentive structure tends to favor delay and escalation over an honest reckoning with sunk costs. If ground forces are eventually committed, I don't think failure looks like a single dramatic withdrawal. It looks more like a prolonged, costly holding pattern, forces securing and protecting specific points, absorbing a steady stream of asymmetric attacks from drones and missiles that are cheap for Iran to produce and expensive for the U.S. to defend against. That mismatch isn't sustainable indefinitely, financially or politically. You end up with something like Vietnam, a military that isn't visibly losing battles in a conventional sense, but also isn't achieving the strategic objective, while the costs keep accumulating. That's arguably the most dangerous outcome, because it never forces a clean decision point. It just grinds on. So who holds the leverage right now? I'd say Iran, and that's a striking thing to say about a much smaller, poorer country facing the world's dominant military power. But leverage isn't just raw capability. It's who can sustain their position longer and who has more to lose from the status quo continuing. Iran controls, or can meaningfully threaten, two of the most important choke points in global energy trade. Every day that continues is a day of economic pressure on the U.S. and the global economy, and a day where the decisive victory promised by the initial strikes looks further away, not closer. The U.S. has overwhelming firepower, but firepower alone hasn't translated into reopened shipping lanes or a compliant Iranian government, which is what winning would actually require.